Cache-Maniacs.
GeoGearHeads.
Well, Bad Cop, I'm very happy to see that you're back in the home studio again this week.
You know, Daryl, I'm happy to be back in my makeshift home studio as well. You know, that just goes to show you that I'm willing to talk geolocation games no matter where I am, be it on the road or sitting in my living room. So, welcome to this, the 30th beta episode of the GeoGearHeads. And this time we're talking with Robert Leip in a moment about GPSBabel. That's the engine that drives the communication between computers and GPSRs for many of the geocaching programs. It's also a standalone program, so I'm really looking forward to finding out a bit more about it.
As am I, and we ran into him at the podcast studio of GeoWoodstock 9, where we interviewed him for the original Cache-Maniacs series. I'm thrilled to get him back on the show, though, to talk about a little bit geekier topic, which is that open source software project. Before we do, we need to talk about what's coming up next week.
Yes, we do. Now, many listeners will remember that Atmosphere, a company that made the GeoMate Junior, was sold earlier this year, and the new owners killed that product line and all its support. The good news is that the GeoMate Junior has been acquired by Brand44, and they're looking into getting into geocaching in a big way. So we'll talk with them next week, and you can catch that live through the Google Plus Hangouts on Air, August 2nd, 6 p.m. or 9 p.m., or I'm sorry, 6 p.m. Pacific or 9 p.m. Eastern. Of course, the show will be released into the feed on Saturday morning, and you'll be able to find out more about Brand 44 and the GeoMate from the MP3 download, or that wonderful YouTube video.
Now, if you do have any feedback for that or any of our shows, email us at geogearheads@cachemaniacs.com. Drop us a note on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Better yet, call in your comments to our voicemail line at 206-350-3647 so you can play them back on the show. We love hearing from you, and it's about time for another one of those randomized shows, so get those comments in any way you like.
Now, if you haven't heard a randomized show, that's where Daryl and I talk about a number of seemingly random topics. The majority of those topics are submitted by our listeners. That's you.
Yep, and sometimes, yeah, that was not so very good. And sometimes those are questions, other times they're recommendations, but it can be anything you like. We've also been talking about doing a couple shows to help geocachers with crossing over from smartphones to GPSRs or from GPSRs to smartphones. And we would like your stories and any kind of problems that you've had, going either way.
Now, a little spoiler for that show, you're better off to have both of them and not rely exclusively on just one.
Very
That's
true.
enough. That's enough of that. We've kept our special guest waiting far too long. Let's bring in Robert Leip, the creator of GPSBabel, and one of the few people who can say he's been to all of the Geo Woodstocks.
Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you.
Oh. Well, first off, let's start off with what is GPSBabel?
It is a cross-platform, meaning it works Mac, Windows, Linux, pretty much any operating system you care about, program that converts geographic data, waypoints, tracks, routes, from one format to another. So if you have a MapSyn file that you need to suck into MapSource, you would use GPSBabel, hat tip to Tower of Babel, to convert from one to the other. You can do other things with that data while you're converting them, such as merging files together, or some of the things that later became challenges in geocaching, interestingly enough, like identifying what county a geocache is in, the Delorme cache pages and so on. We have nerdy math for figuring out which polygon a point is within, so we can easily figure out which county. And that's one of the many, many tricks that we do in GPSBabel.
Yeah, so it's a kind of program that can take a file and convert it to a different file, or take data to and from a GPS.
Right. It occurred to me very early on that, you know, in the original version, you know, I was reading from here and writing to here, and this piece was a GPS, and then this piece was a file format, and then it's like, oh, but I don't like this file format. I need a different one. It occurred to me that once you have that line right in the middle, it's very easy to, you know, read from here and write to here. Maybe filtering or doing some kind of nerd stuff to it on the way. So, like during GeoWoodstock 2, we were offering to preload, we were doing like a poker run style geocaching thing at the event. So we had laptops that were constantly reading from one file, and then we had the 2 Magellan cables that were in use at the time and the 2 Garmin cables. Each laptop was fanning out to 4 GPSs because, you know, doing that conversion was just as easy as doing them all serially, and we could load 4 different people at once. So not something you need often, but a cute trick if you're trying to serve a couple hundred people up fast.
Impressive. Now, can you give us a little history of GPSBabel? Why did you build it?
I built it because I've been a programmer since the 80s. I started geocaching. My first GPS was in 2001, and for my 6th find, I mistyped the coordinates, and I spent a ridiculous amount of time looking for it in what I now know was not even close to the right place. I'm like, man, there ought to be a program for this. And I looked, and I was a Linux user at the time, and there were terrible, terrible tools. I'm like, oh, fine, I'll write one. Because at the time, Magellan was very good about publishing the specs to their things. So you could go to their website, get the protocol spec, and like, oh, this is serial communications. This is not that hard. So from that one DNF, I was motivated to build the original tool. And being I was actually working for a Unix company at the time. One of the Unix philosophies is small, simple tools that talk to each other. And so I wrote this very small, well, at the time it was very small, now it's not so small. It's funny how 10 years will do that to a program. You know, I mean, all it did was pick stuff up from here, shake it up, put it down over here. So it was, you know, it was a fundamental thing for it to be used as the thing that did that task for other programs.
Now, a lot of the time when people do build you know, tools that are really useful like that, they will try to get some cash for it, either in licensing or whatnot. Why was it that you decided to just go entirely free?
At the time, well, I mean, it's tough because if I had charged, you know, $10 a copy or, you know, any fixed amount from the beginning, I don't know that it would have caught the traction that it did. First, it was a very niche market at the time. No one, I mean, GPS was, you know, if you had a big, fancy GPS, it had 8 megabytes of memory. Yes, megabytes. So it was kind of a niche thing, and a lot of the Unix software, which is where my background is free. But I wanted to make it available to other people, other folks, so they could benefit from it, and to make it available especially to other programmers so they could modify it, and, you know, if they needed some other format added, they could do it and chip that in, and it would snowball. And to some degree, that's worked.
Well, and that is why a lot of companies like to go open source, is because instead of just being one person, you get this huge community that contributes to it by building in what they need that you might not have built into the original program.
Right. I mean, by it being open as opposed to just free, if you don't like the way some aspect of it works, you're free to modify it yourself or hire a programmer or, you know, bribe the high school kid down the street to make a change for you or whatever. I mean, you can contract out the work. And ideally, you chip that back into the community, and it helps the others.
So we get the idea that it takes data, massages it, and spits it back out. What are some of the programs that it's been used in?
A lot. One of the things that surprised me when I started really getting into the GPS community and understanding it was how many different niches there are. What the GPSs and the tools used by geocachers are very different than the ones used by over-the-road truck drivers or Autobahn motorcycle communities. So there's a lot of different worlds that it plays in. Geocaching, of course, this being a geocaching-centric show, GSAC is, of course, the poster child. We've had a strong relationship with GSAC for many, many years. I think all of the Mac geocaching programs like Mac Caching and iCaching use it. There have been a few other geocaching programs that are escaping my mind right now. Google Earth, obviously a very popular program with over 1 billion users. It uses it for all of its GPS communication and several of the file imports. For example, did you know you can drag and drop a pocket query into Google Earth? Google Earth, wink wink, GPSBabel, knows enough about pocket queries to format them specially to show up in Google Earth. And that feature is about to get a whole lot cooler in the next version or two. So, some people have made tools that make GPSBabel easier to use in some ways for other people. Huda GPS is a Mac wrapper for GPSBabel. GPS Visualizer is a website that makes it very easy to map and display your data graphically. It uses GPSBabel under the hood in several of its components. Geographic Information Systems, GIS, OpenStreetMap uses GPSBabel to import from people's GPSs so they can contribute roads and stuff, as well as use some of our nerdy math skills to do things like simplify the lines. You have a track with 150,000 points that represents a road. Well, no, you probably actually need way less than 150,000 points to do it. GPSBabel Simplify filter does that. Quantum GIS and Prune are other GIS tools that use GPSBabel for imports and exports. Geotagging, the use of especially the little logger receivers, the little $100, size of a Tic Tac, no screen. Those are very popular in the photography community. GPSBabel is used by GPixSync, Huda Geo, and a program called Geotag to take the timestamp of your photograph, correlate that against your track log, and figure out where that photograph was taken. The GPS users use it, the GPS makers. Magellan uses it in Vantage Point. One of the programmers joked, remember Magellan has gone through a series of acquisitions in the last 10 years. They said that GPSBabel read and wrote the older file formats better than they could find code that did it. Garmin reaches into Google Earth. Rather than writing their own KML, they reach into Google Earth's copy of GPSBabel to inject GDB files in so they can be pulled into Google Earth. So in addition to all of the tools that use GPSBabel directly, there's a lot of programs that are using it.
Well, I imagine it took a lot to develop and test. So, especially over all this time, but what kind of development really went into it? How much testing and stuff did you actually have to do?
A ridiculous amount. I've supported the project by a tip jar on the website. If you find it useful, help support the project by all means. But especially in the early days when a decent GPS was $1,200, $1,300, it takes a lot of tip jars to really move that along. So I was, borrowing and a lot more in the early days. Thankfully, they're not that much anymore. But I have over 100 GPSs in the lab. Yeah.
Wow.
Imagine the cables on my desk. I've actually built a device on the wall with a PC power supply because it was the cheapest 12-volt power supply I could get. It fans out to 21 USB ports with a trainload of serial USB converters. The whole thing hinges away from the wall so I can get to the cables behind it. But there's about 60 GPSs in that test fixture. There's an automated test suite that we run, so for every file, every time we make a change, we know that it works at least as well as it did before we made the change. So there's several hundred, maybe even a low number of thousands of tests that, if you add a new file format, take a snapshot, a representative file, convert it to GPX or something that we can easily see. And that way, when somebody's reporting a problem on FreeBSD or something that I don't have ready access to a FreeBSD system, but they know that if they build it and it passes that test, it works. So it's an engineering commitment.
Well, I assume that every time you have a change in the software, you have to go back, test that new software, and I'm talking the firmware for the GPSRs. Yeah, every time you get a new version of the firmware, you're going to have to go and retest to make sure something wasn't broken by a change that was made.
Yeah, and the reality is most of the vendors, in the early days, Garmin, I'm looking at you.
Subtle.
No, I've told it to their face. Every version of the firmware that would come along would introduce, it's like, oh, we said they decided to put 3 bytes in the middle of this packet. Really? They would change, and the docs wouldn't keep up. And in modern times, it's a lot better than it used to be. The ones that are still sloppy are the logger guys. The reality is a $49 device doesn't get a lot of really high power engineering effort put into it, and I think they're just sloppy.
Yeah.
And the reality is, you react, you try to catch up. You do what you can. So.
Now, before we move on from talking about the software, even though we kind of have already, I did want to bring up a question, though, which is there's been a lot of discussion lately on the open source licensing and things like the iTunes store in particular. This has really been a case for iOS, but it holds true of like the Mac store as well, where most of those open source licenses aren't compatible with the terms of the app stores.
That's an excellent question, and one that I've been struggling with. The reality is the license I chose 10 plus years ago says if you accept this software, one of the things you have to be able to do is to give it away to somebody else. No additional rights can be taken away from. You may not restrict the redistribution of the program. And the reality is the license agreement for both the Apple Store, the Apple Mac Store, and the iTunes Music Store for iOS, not the Music Store, obviously. GPSBabel, the song. They do add additional restrictions. They don't require you to publish the source. In fact, they make it difficult for you to publish the source. So, by strict definition, GPSBabel should not be used in any software that's currently in the iTunes store. The reality is, it is. You can download demo versions and see. It's like, you open the .app, and in Contents Resources is a file named GPSBabel. And you type GPSBabel -v. It's like, even down to the typos I made in the help file. Yeah, that's mine, guys. So I've been struggling with what do you do? I mean, you build the software to be used. Do you want to play the temper tantrum and start sending takedowns and cease and desists and litigate? I don't know that that's really the right way to go. But I do wish that people would not cover up that it's like, I saved myself probably 10 man years of engineering time using this thing, and I'm supposed to tell you you're using this thing, but oopsie, I forgot. Then that's not really very cool either. So I know of several programs in the store that are doing that, and it's not cool, but I've not really decided what to do about that. So if you have any lawyer friends with time on their hands, send them my way. I could use some good strong advice on that, because I don't really want to be the bad boy, but I don't want to be ripped off either. So.
Yeah, it is such a can of worms. You can get into the licensing like that, but in the end, does it really help anyone to get all huffy and puffy with the guys who are, putting it in and developing it? It's really an issue with these stores, and I'm not sure that anything short of all of the developers getting on them about it would really help. And Apple doesn't really seem to be moved very much by such arguments.
Well, the poster child for this is a program that, in fact, in some ways is like GPSBabel. It's a video player called VLC. And the VideoLAN media module is the thing that's used in almost all of the things that can play audio and video. They wrote this very good core that's useful to other programs. They got huffy and puffy, I guess it's about 2 years ago, and started sending takedown letters to program after program in the iTunes store. They got all of them yanked. They got a lot of publicity out of it too. Did it really advance the effort of their project? Probably not. It made people more aware of the licensing issues, certainly.
Yeah, and I think that's about it. And Apple certainly doesn't seem to have cared, because we still have the same problems today that we did then.
I like my Apple products. I'm talking to you right now on one. But once they make up their mind about something, no, the market does not change their mind.
No, and they generally have some good reasons for doing so. We just might not agree with them, and unless it's something big like the whole EP thing that they went through recently, it's just not something they seem to waver on. Once they've made their decision, they tend to stand by that.
Yep, and it's unfortunate, because it's I'm not sure that I really want to put the users in the middle of this, but it's so easy to actually comply with the GPL, the GNU public license. They just added restrictions that make it impossible to do so. So, I mean, I'm a dude working on this in my nights and weekends. It's not like I'm going to wag that particular dog.
Yeah, and we don't mean to imply that Apple's by any means the only one who's got issues like this. They're just the poster child for these kind of issues.
I agree with both points.
So with all that being said, are there any mobile platforms, or the possibility of mobile platforms such as the iOS or Android products?
Well, by day I'm a software engineer for Google. I work on Google Earth, currently in the mobile division, so I work on the mobile platforms. Obviously, this is something I've thought quite a bit about. I'd like to hear the thoughts of the audience on this. Frankly, a lot of GPSBabel's superpowers don't make sense on a mobile device. You don't need to convert a map source file to a map-send file, or reduce a GPX track to its core or whatever. A lot of the features just don't make sense. The one thing I have thought of that does make some sense is a very small market, and it's a lot of work to do. Notably, we're a program written in C, not in Java, so we would have to use the native development kit. We would have to jack in a new USB layer. Well, I mean, we already have a different layer for Mac and Windows and Linux, so we have a nice abstraction point there. The only time I can think of that it makes sense is for the older GPSs, like the 60. If you wanted to transfer data like from a GPX file, a pocket query, to an older device, those models have been discontinued for a long time, and you need a feature called USB on the go to support host mode on the device. Relatively few Android devices support that. Apple doesn't open up the protocol layer at all, to my knowledge. You can't just do raw USB bit banging on the USB port. Android only added it in 3.1 or 3.2 of the Honeycomb branch, and rather few Android phones or tablets even have the hardware support. I mean, the OS support and the mobile support, those will only grow over time. But the reality is, for all the devices that are even vaguely modern in geocaching land, anything newer than a Colorado, all of the Nuvies, the Colorado, all the others, the Dakota, Montana, Oregon. It's like I'm sitting here naming states.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm in the 5th grade. The capital of, those. If you have a device with USB host mode, that was a soda about to go off the table. If you have a device that has host mode, you can use a program like the Lynda file transfer program, which lets you copy stuff to and from. You download the GPX file from Groundspeak. You copy it to the right place in the GPS, wait a few seconds, eject it, you're done. So I don't know that GPSBabel makes a lot of sense in mobile land. If somebody wanted to convince me otherwise, I'm listening.
So folks, you're hearing that. You need to call in to area code 206-3. I forgot the number as soon as I said it. You need to call in to area code 206-350-3647 and tell Robert what and how to use GPSBabel on mobile devices. And what you want.
Yeah, that was an interesting place to pause. And it's like a dueling piano bar. Suggestions written on the backs of $100 bills, get to the front of the line.
There you go.
Well, GPSBabel really has done a lot to change the way that we work with our GPSs and the way the computers work and everything. So how have you seen it as being a change in the world as a whole? Well, obviously GPS has become much more ubiquitous since I started messing with them in 2001. Now at any time, most of us have one or more on our bodies somewhere. Your phones, people, your phones. I think that, I was involved in the early stages of developing the GPX file format, and I think that making this stuff talk to each other, by unlocking a lot of the data that had been in proprietary formats, has helped the communication between the different programs talking different file formats. Over 4 million people have downloaded, GPSBabel from GPSBabel.org. In addition to all of the ones using it in the programs that we spoke above. I don't have a download count of how many copies of Magellan thingy they've distributed. So it's been a very popular program. When I first started having the idea that it was useful to have that dividing line of reading here and writing here, there were 4 formats. When I first released the first public version, there were 10, and I thought, well, how many more ways can there be to represent a latitude, a longitude, and an altitude? 200 formats later.
Wow.
We support several hundred GPSs these days. So, just like how many different ways are there to represent a position? My word, how many different movies do we need? It's also been kind of a watering hole for programmers to get together to discuss reverse engineering details, because we've been kind of the place where those guys hang out. Somebody's trying to crack a new format. They usually come to us, and it usually ends up as a module in GPSBabel. And we were one of the very early programs to be cross-platform. Because I was a Unix guy, and that's where it existed first. We already covered, the 1% of desktop-y kinds of systems. I had some friends local that needed a program like this, so I built a version for Windows that covered the 90%. And obviously the Apple desktop market is much larger now than it was then. So since we also do Mac, well, we've got that 9. So by the numbers, we've got that covered. And we were cross-platform before Google Earth was, before Basecamp existed on Mac. So I think we've been a good example that you can do software that's portable.
Mm-hmm. Before we let you go, I have to ask, you mentioned that you were sitting at the GeoWoodstock 2, I think it was, with GPSBabel and a bunch of different cables. And a lot of the guys I see now doing this are doing it through GSAC just because that's what they're familiar with. Have you been using GPSBabel, the standalone app, to do the loading, or has that kind of switched over to GSAC for you as well?
This could be awkward. I don't actually use GSAC. I'm kind of the guy that builds the jet engine that doesn't know how to fly, that builds the transmission that doesn't know how to drive a car. I've always loaded my stuff with raw GPSBabel because, well, duh. That's I'm very comfortable with it. But obviously the GeoWoodstock 2 thing was held locally because, GeoGPS, it just came from this area. It was a unique need. How do you, you have a line that goes all the way out of that field. How do you fill them fast? Well, I have obviously USB serial adapters and cables in spades. It's like snakes all around me. So when we were trying to solve that problem, a program that we knew could do all of them at once was the way to solve it. I've cached with Colorado, Oregon, for some time. So, really for geocaching, I'm fine just copying files to the unit and hunting. There are people that are really into the additional notes, additional waypoints, solve the puzzles. I totally get the power of it, and I'm amazed at the community that Clyde has built around GSAC. It's an amazing set of tools, but for example, I have a friend that uses it. She stores all of her solved puzzles in it. I don't hunt puzzle caches. I solve problems for a living. I want to go hunt Tupperware in the woods. Part of that's a reflection just on how I use geocaching as a hobby to get away from solving problems.
Yeah, well, I love the idea of just using GPSBabel. It's so much lighter weight than using the full GSAC is. But really my end-all be-all for an event would be having some kind of touch screen where you walk up, plug in your device, hit a button for which protocol it uses, and you walk away when it says done.
See, we didn't even have a button to push. It was more like a if you can imagine how they fuel up Indy cars. you pull into the thing, you jam the cable in, it's like, clear! Because the program it was just reading the side and writing over and over to all the ports that it had. And you plugged the cable in, it would start filling them up. Once it beeped and said, beep, transfer done, because that's what they did, you pulled the cable out, next guy comes along. There was no partial fill. You were guaranteed a full tank every time.
Yeah, well, at that point, it was a little bit easier because you were just doing everything as the waypoints. You didn't have the full cache information being sent down as the GPX file into the, whatever directory they're using on that GPS.
GeoGearHeads 2 was simpler times, young man. Then again, you could argue that it actually would be simpler now because a micro USB and you just spray a GPX file into it. That solves all the modern GPSs. If you had a couple lines for those and then a line or two for the guys still on, a Meridian or a 60, that's probably not the fast lane to fill anymore. So.
Yeah, or the guys using the DeLorme with its funny 4-pin cable.
Yes, that funny 4-pin cable.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real treat to get to know a little bit about the backbone of just about all communications with GPSs.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed talking about it. So.
And of course, we'll have links to GPSBabel.org on the website so people can track that down.
Groovy. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Check the Cachemaniacs websites at cachemaniacs.com for more on the GeoGearHeads, including show notes from this and all our episodes. We love hearing from our listeners, so leave us feedback by calling 206-350-3647, by emailing geogearheads at cachemaniacs.com, or through social media. Your support helps keep the Cachemaniacs shows coming. So please consider making a PayPal donation through the link on our website to support the Cachemaniacs shows. GeoGearHeads is produced by Chris Umfenauer and Daryl Wattenberg. This show is copyright 2012 by Daryl Wattenberg, all rights reserved.
Yes, we're the Cachemaniacs.